The air in Elian's assigned dwelling was a monument to sterility, a carefully curated absence of scent that was meant to be calming but felt to him like a slow suffocation. It smelled of recycled oxygen, of the faint ozone tank, of the ionizer, and the cool, flat neutrality of polished plasteel. Every surface was smooth, every corner a perfect, unyielding right angle. This was the architecture of control, a physical manifestation of the consortium's philosophy. Order imposed upon the chaos of biology. He ran a hand over the cool, seamless surface of his work table, the only place in the small, white chamber where disorder was permitted. Here, lumps of raw clay waited, their earthy, organic scent a tiny rebellion against the sterile air. His fingers, long and sensitive, twitched with the ghost of creation, the remembered pressure of shaping something formless into being. Tonight, however, the clay remained untouched. A quiet anxiety, a low-frequency hum beneath the surface of his thoughts, kept him still. It was the same feeling that had followed him for weeks, a sense of being watched not by eyes, but by something more fundamental, more invasive. Kale's visit had been a welcome disruption. His best friend, a beta whose scent was a mild, pleasant echo of warm paper and ink, filled the space with an easy energy that temporarily pushed back the sterile silence. They had talked for hours, Kyle recounting the minutiae of his work in the archives, his voice a soothing counterpoint to the ever-present hum of the building's life support. Kyle was a creature of the system, comfortable within its clean lines and predictable rhythms, but his affection for Elian was genuine, a pocket of warmth in a cold, regulated world. He saw Elian not as a designation, not as a delicate, unpresented omega whose biology was a ticking clock, but simply as his friend, a friend who was too quiet, too thoughtful, who spent too much time with his hands covered in mud, trying to pull faces from the earth. "He's coming for dinner tomorrow," Kyle had said, his casual tone failing to mask the flicker of apprehension in his eyes. Reese. The name landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. Reese, Kale's older brother, Prefect Reese, an alpha of significant standing within the consortium's regulatory body, the very institution that classified and managed lives like Elian's. Elian had only met him a few times, but each encounter was etched into his memory with chilling clarity. Reese did not move like other alphas, who often carried a subtle aura of physical confidence and territorial ease. Reese moved with the silent, deliberate precision of a predator that knows it has no natural enemies. His scent wasn't the warm, musky spice of most alphas. It was cold, a sharp, clean fragrance like frost on metal, a scent that seemed to absorb the warmth from the air around it. It was the scent of absolute chilling control. "Oh," Elian had managed, his own voice sounding thin. "That's good for you." Kyle had sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He worries about you. He thinks I'm not pragmatic enough about your situation." The word hung between them. Situation, the polite consortium term for Elian's unpresented, unbonded state, an anomaly in a system designed for pairings, for stability, for the neat categorization of every living soul. To be an omega was to be a precious, volatile resource. To be an unpresented omega of Elian's age was to be an unsolved equation, a potential source of chaos. Now, hours after Kale had left, the echo of that name, Reese, still seemed to vibrate in the sterile air. Elian felt a tremor run through him, a biological instinct he had been trained his whole life to suppress. It was a faint, primal urge to make himself smaller, to hide. He pushed it down, attributing it to the conversation, to the looming prospect of another dinner spent under that cool, analytical gaze. He prepared for sleep, the ritual movements automatic and precise. He swallowed the small white pill, the daily suppressant that kept his scent muted, his hormones in check, a chemical leash mandated by the consortium for all unpresented omegas. He lay down on the thin mattress, the fabric of the sheets cool and impersonal against his skin. The lights in the chamber dimmed on their scheduled cycle, plunging the room into a soft, artificial twilight. He closed his eyes, willing his mind to settle, to find the quiet, dreamless void of regulated sleep. But the anxiety remained, a cold knot in his stomach. It felt like a premonition, a whisper of warning from a part of himself he didn't know how to listen to. He drifted, not into peaceful sleep, but into a heavy, unsettling darkness, the scent of ozone and frost clinging to the edges of his consciousness like a phantom touch. The last thing he felt was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, as if his own body were a weight too heavy to carry, pulling him down into the deep. He woke to a violation. It was not a sound, not a touch, but a scent that did not belong. It was rich and complex, an invasive presence in the sterile sanctuary of his room. It was ozone and frost, yes, but deeper now, unfurled from its usual tight control, laced with something dark and possessive, like cold stone and winter pine. It was Reese's scent, and it was everywhere. It clung to his sheets, saturated the air he breathed, and most horrifyingly, it emanated from his own skin. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of sleep. He sat bolt upright, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The movement sent a sharp, biting pain through the side of his neck, at the delicate juncture where his neck met his shoulder. A gasp tore from his throat, raw and painful. His hand flew to the spot, his fingers trembling as they brushed against his skin. It was tender, swollen, and slick with what he dimly recognized as saliva. And beneath the swelling, his fingertips traced the unmistakable raised edges of a bite. A mark, a claiming mark. The world tilted, the white walls of his room seeming to press in on him, the recycled air suddenly too thick to breathe. He scrambled out of bed, his legs unsteady, and stumbled to the small sanitation unit. His reflection stared back at him from the polished chrome surface, a stranger with wide, terrified eyes and a face bleached of all color. He angled his head, his movements jerky, robotic. There, on the pale skin of his neck, was the evidence. A brutal, purpled bruise in the distinct shape of a jaw, the skin broken by the deep impression of canine teeth. It was a seal, a brand, an alpha's claim, bitten deep into the scent gland of an omega, an act of profound intimacy and absolute possession, a bond forged in flesh and pheromones, meant to be offered and accepted in a haze of euphoric consent. But he had been asleep. He had been alone. The memories of the night were a black void, a gaping hole where this desecration had occurred. He was not a partner. He was not chosen. He was property, taken in the dark. A wave of nausea churned in his stomach. He braced his hands against the cool metal of the sink, his knuckles white. The scent, Reese's scent, was a suffocating shroud, a constant reminder. It was in him, on him, a part of him now. He scrubbed at his neck, his fingers raw, desperate to wipe it away. But the scent wasn't on the surface. It was blooming from within, his own body's chemistry forcibly rewritten, his scent glands now producing a horrifying hybrid of his own subtle fragrance and Reese's dominant, chilling one. He was marked, he was bonded, to an alpha who looked at him with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen, to his best friend's brother. He felt a sob build in his chest, a ragged, tearing sound. But he choked it back. Sound was a luxury he couldn't afford. Panic was a weakness he could not show. The consortium's sensors would register any significant emotional spike, any deviation from baseline calm. They would come, they would investigate, and they would find the illegal, non-consensual bond. What they would do to him then was a terror he could not even begin to fathom. Stasis, reprogramming, vivisection, all were clinical possibilities in the consortium's detached pursuit of order. He looked at his own reflection again, at the terrified Omega staring back, and saw the truth. His life, the small, quiet, constrained existence he had known, was over. It had been stolen from him while he slept. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in feigned normalcy. Elian moved through his day like an automaton, his actions dictated by a script he had been rehearsing his entire life. He rose, he consumed his nutrient paste, he tidied his already immaculate dwelling. Every movement was precise, measured, designed to project an aura of calm compliance. But beneath the surface, a war was raging. His body was a battleground. The foreign pheromones, the alpha's claim, were working their way through his system like a slow-acting poison, and his own biology, suppressed for so long, was roaring to life in a confused, chaotic response. Waves of heat, sharp and dizzying, would wash over him, followed by bone-deep chills that left him trembling. His own scent, once a faint, clean smell, like rain on limestone, was now warped, tainted by the sharp, metallic tang of Reese's. He spent an hour in the sanitation unit, applying a thick, medical-grade concealer to the brutal mark on his neck. The paste was cold against his inflamed skin, a poor mask for the violation that lay beneath. He chose his tunic with care, selecting one with the highest, stiffest collar, a garment designed for formality that now served as a desperate piece of armor. He felt the fabric chafe against the tender skin, a constant, nagging reminder. Then came the first intrusion. He was standing by his work table, his hand hovering over a piece of clay, trying to summon the will to create, to do something that was his own. Suddenly, a flash of an image, not his own, seared across his mind's eye. A datapad displaying columns of shifting numbers, the cool blue light of a sterile office, the faint taste of bitter, synthesized coffee. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving him dizzy and disoriented. He stumbled back, his hand pressed to his temple. It was Reese. The bond, the new and horrifying neural link forged by the marking, was opening a one-way window into the Alpha's consciousness. He could feel the distant echo of Reese's focus, a cold, unwavering concentration that was utterly devoid of emotion. It was a chillingly intimate violation, a trespass not just on his body, but on the last sacred space he possessed, his own mind. He had to see Kale. He had to maintain the fiction of their friendship, of his unchanged life. When Kale arrived that afternoon, his familiar, warm presence was almost painful. Elian kept his posture rigid, his chin high, hoping the stiff collar would not draw attention. "You seem tense," Kyle observed, his brow furrowed with concern. "Is it about dinner tonight? Don't worry, I'll run interference with Reese." Elian forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "I'm fine. Just didn't sleep well." The lie was ash in his mouth. Kale didn't press, but his gaze lingered, and Elian felt a fresh wave of panic. How long could he hide this? How long until the changes in his scent, his demeanor, became too obvious to ignore? That evening, Rhys arrived. He entered the small common area Kyle had reserved, and the air temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. He was the image of consortium authority, his dark uniform impeccably tailored, his posture erect, his expression a mask of cool neutrality. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, found Elian's immediately. There was no flicker of triumph, no hint of malice. There was only a calm, possessive assessment, the look of a man confirming the status of his property. Elian's breath caught in his throat. Through the bond, he felt a faint, controlled pulse of satisfaction. It was not a hot, passionate emotion, but a cold, clinical contentment, the feeling of a complex equation being solved. "Elian," Rhys said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the floor. "It is good to see you are well." The subtext was a blade against his skin. "I have made you well. I have corrected your flaw." Elian could only nod, his throat too tight to form words. He endured the meal in a state of hyper-vigilant terror. He kept his head angled away from Rhys, praying the dim lighting and his high collar would be enough. He watched Rhys move, listened to him speak of sector logistics and resource allocation with Kale, and with every passing moment, the monstrous reality of the situation solidified. This was not a rogue alpha acting on impulse. This was a calculated act of ownership by a man who embodied the system itself. As they were leaving, Rhys paused beside him. He didn't touch him, but Elian felt the proximity like a physical blow. "You have been looking pale," Rhys murmured, his voice too low for Kale to hear. "I have had a specialized nutrient supplement allocated to you. It will be delivered with your morning rations. Ensure you take it, for your stability." It was not a suggestion. It was a command. Elian stared at him, his heart hammering. A supplement, something to be ingested, to work its way through his body. What was it? Something to strengthen the bond, to make him more compliant, to finalize the chemical subjugation that had begun with the bite? He felt the mental touch again, a whisper of Rhys's thoughts bleeding into his own. Order, balance, necessity. Rhys's gaze held his for a moment longer, and in their cold depths, Elian saw no remorse, no guilt. He saw only the unwavering certainty of a man who believed he had every right to do what he had done. He was not a person to Rhys. He was a problem that had been solved. Desperation became a physical entity, a cold, heavy weight in Elian's chest. The specialized nutrient supplement had arrived as promised, a sleek, silver tube containing a viscous, tasteless fluid. He had stared at it for a long time, the command from Rhys echoing in his mind, a command he felt a horrifying biological urge to obey. The bond was a master's leash, and it was already tightening. He had poured the fluid down the disposal unit, his hands shaking, and then spent the rest of the morning fighting waves of anxiety, a phantom guilt that was not his own. He needed information. He needed to understand what had been done to him, and if there was any way at all, to undo it. The consortium's public network was a carefully manicured garden of approved knowledge. Anything about bonding was clinical, romanticized, and focused entirely on sanctioned, consensual pairings. There was no mention of what happened when the bond was a violation, no protocol for its removal. It was an eventuality the system simply did not acknowledge. To find answers, he would have to go deeper, into the illicit, unmonitored corners of the network, a place known colloquially as the undercurrent. Accessing it was a risk. Unauthorized network use was a serious offense, tracked and punished with ruthless efficiency. But the alternative, passive acceptance of his new reality, was a fate worse than any punishment. He retrieved the datapad Kale had gifted him years ago, a standard-issue device that he had painstakingly modified in secret. Installing backdoors and cloaking software learned from fragmented data files he'd found buried in archival records. It was a small act of rebellion he had never thought he would need to use for anything more than accessing banned art archives. Now, it was his only lifeline. Huddled in his dwelling, with the lights dimmed and the audio sensors baffled by a low-frequency hum from his sculpting tools, he plunged into the digital chaos of the undercurrent. The interface was a jarring contrast to the clean, orderly design of the official network. It was a chaotic mess of encrypted nodes, ghost forums, and hidden data caches. He navigated with clumsy haste, his search queries blunt and desperate. Forced bonding, illegal claim, bond severance, Omega trauma. Most of the results were dead ends, paranoid ramblings, or traps laid by consortium security. But then he found it. A heavily encrypted text titled The Unmaking, a treatise on biochemical bond dissonance. It was not a scientific paper, but a desperate, fragmented journal written by an anonymous Omega scholar from generations past, before the consortium's control had become absolute. The language was archaic, a mix of scientific terminology and raw poetic anguish. It spoke of the bond not as a sacred union, but as a parasitic psychic link, a form of neurological slavery. It described the process of a forced bonding in horrifying detail, the alpha's pheromones hijacking the omega's endocrine system, the bite creating a permanent bioport for the transmission of neural and emotional data, rewriting the omega's very identity at a chemical level. Elian felt a cold dread as he read words that mirrored his own experience. The sensory intrusions, the emotional echoes, the slow erosion of self. The alpha becomes the sun, the text read, and the omega is but a planet, caught in its gravity, its own rotation dictated by the will of the star. To resist is to tear oneself apart. But the text also spoke of whispers, of legends, of a way to fight back. It was not a clean severance, not a simple antidote. The author called it building a wall, a conscious, painful act of mental fortification to block the alpha's influence. It required immense focus, a deep understanding of one's own inner landscape, and the ability to find the seam where one's own consciousness ended and the alpha's began. It was a battle fought in the silent theater of the mind, and it mentioned something else, a last resort, a substance called locus, a rare naturally occurring neuroinhibitor found only in one specific, uncultivated biome that could supposedly dissolve the pheromonal markers of a bond. But the text warned that the process was agonizing, dangerous, and could result in permanent neurological damage, or even death. The location of this biome was lost to history, referred to only by a cryptic name, Sanctuary, a place beyond the consortium's reach. Hope, fragile and terrifying, began to bloom in the sterile confines of his fear. It was a sliver of a chance, a path that was not simple submission. He downloaded the encrypted text, his fingers flying across the datapad. As the file transfer completed, a new sensation pierced his concentration, a sharp, cold spike of irritation, followed by the mental image of a subordinate delivering an unsatisfactory report. It was Reese. The alpha was annoyed, his focus momentarily broken, and the emotion bled through the bond, sharp and unwelcome. Elian flinched, quickly shutting down the datapad and severing the connection. He could feel Reese's distant, probing curiosity, a faint mental pressure as the alpha registered the sudden silence from his end of the bond. Elian squeezed his eyes shut, focusing on the words from the text. Find the seam. Build the wall. He visualized a barrier of grey stone, brick by painful brick, rising in the darkness of his mind. He focused on his own feelings, the fear, the rage, the desperation, and used them as mortar. He was not a planet. He was not a moon. He was himself. The probing sensation receded, as if meeting an unexpected resistance. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. He opened his eyes, his breathing ragged. The fight had begun. Kyle's concern was becoming a persistent, gentle pressure that Elian no longer knew how to deflect. His friend saw the high collars, the new pallor of his skin, the dark circles under his eyes. He saw the way Elian flinched at sudden noises, the way his gaze would go distant and unfocused for long moments. "You're not eating," Kyle said one afternoon, his voice laced with an anxiety that felt like a physical weight on Elian's shoulders. "You've barely touched your rations all week. Is it the supplement? Is it making you ill?" Elian looked at the untouched nutrient paste, his stomach twisting at the thought of food. "I'm not hungry." The lie was thin, pathetic. He was starving, but every time he tried to eat, the faint, phantom taste of bitter coffee, Reese's coffee, would coat his tongue, and a wave of nausea would overwhelm him. His senses were no longer his own. They were a shared space, a violated territory. The bond was a relentless tide, and his small, hastily constructed mental wall was not enough to hold it back. The intrusions were becoming more frequent, more vivid. He experienced the world through Reese's senses in jarring, disorienting fragments. He felt the crisp, cold air of the prefect's high-altitude transport on his skin, even as he sat in his temperature-controlled room. He smelled the astringent scent of a detention facility's cleansing protocols while trying to breathe the familiar, earthy scent of his clay. He felt the dull ache in Reese's shoulder from an old training injury, a ghost pain that settled deep in his own bones. The most disturbing part was the emotional bleed. Reese's inner world was a silent, ordered landscape of logic and control. The primary emotions Elian felt from him were a cold, persistent dissatisfaction with the inefficiency of others, a flicker of clinical interest in a complex problem, and the ever-present, low-level hum of absolute certainty in his own righteousness. There was no joy, no warmth, no doubt. It was the emotional terrain of a perfect machine, and it was slowly, insidiously, leaching the color from Elian's own world. His art, his only refuge, had become a casualty. He would sit at his work table, his hands poised over the clay, and find himself unable to create. The faces he used to coax from the earth, full of soft lines and unspoken melancholy, now felt alien to him. His hands would move with a new, sharp precision, carving hard angles and severe, emotionless expressions that mirrored the cold logic seeping into his mind. He would look down at the cruel, unfamiliar sculpture and feel a profound sense of horror and self-loathing. It was Reese's aesthetic, the beauty of function, of order, of strength, emerging through his own hands. His hands were not his own. His thoughts were not his own. The phrase became a silent mantra, a desperate anchor in the storm. One evening, the intrusion was more powerful than ever before. Elian was lying on his cot, trying to meditate to reinforce his mental wall, when he was suddenly plunged into Rhys's perspective with breathtaking clarity. He was standing in a brightly lit white room, looking down at an Omega. The Omega was younger than Elian, and was curled on the floor weeping, his scent a wild, uncontrolled spike of fear and distress. A medic stood nearby, holding a hypo spray. Rhys, he, felt a surge of cold impatience. The chaos, the emotional incontinence, it was an offense to his sensibilities. He heard his own voice, filtered through Rhys's ears, low and devoid of sympathy. The emotional instability is pronounced, a clear case for level 3 intervention. His designated alpha is incapable of managing him. Sedate him and begin the hormonal regulation protocol. The medic nodded and moved toward the crying boy. Elian, trapped in Rhys's mind, felt a flicker of grim satisfaction from the alpha. Order restored, chaos contained. The vision shattered, throwing Elian back into his own body with a violent jolt. He gasped for air, his heart pounding. He had just witnessed Rhys condemning another Omega to chemical pacification, to the systematic stripping away of his emotional responses. And the alpha had felt nothing but the quiet pride of a job well done. This was the man he was bonded to. Not just a man who had violated him, but a man who was a living embodiment of the system's most brutal tenets. He realized then that the supplement Rhys had prescribed for him was likely the first step of that same protocol. Rhys wasn't just claiming him, he was curing him of the emotional volatility he so despised. The bond was not about possession in a passionate sense, it was about reprogramming. He was an experiment. He was a flawed piece of hardware being forcibly upgraded. The rage that filled him was a pure, white-hot flame. It burned through the fog of confusion and fear, leaving behind a hard, crystalline certainty. He would not be erased. He would not be rewritten. He scrambled for the datapad, his hands steady now, his purpose clear. He opened the encrypted file, the unmaking. He read the section on building a mental wall again, but this time he saw it not just as a defense, but as a weapon. The bond was a two-way street. If Rhys could push his thoughts and feelings onto him, what could he push back? He closed his eyes, sinking into the mental space where their consciousnesses touched. He found the cold, orderly landscape of Rhys's mind, and into that silent, sterile world he projected a single, powerful image. The face of the weeping Omega on the white floor, and all the terror and despair he had felt in that moment. For the first time, he felt Rhys flinch. He could not endure it any longer. The constant intrusions, the gnawing erosion of his own mind, the suffocating presence of Rhys's cold consciousness. It was a slow, living death. The small act of pushing back, of forcing Rhys to experience a fraction of the pain he inflicted, had provided a moment of fierce, defiant clarity. But it had also escalated the conflict. The mental pressure from Rhys had increased, becoming a steady, insistent force against his weakening walls, a silent command to submit, comply, be still. The time for hiding was over. He needed a confrontation. He needed to hear the justification from the man's own lips, to see the face of his violator without the filter of a psychic link. He sent a simple, terse message to Kale. I need to speak with your brother. Alone. The request was so out of character that Kale agreed without question, his concern overriding his confusion. He arranged the meeting in a neutral space, a small private observation deck overlooking the city's meticulously planned grid of transport tubes and residential blocks. The view was a perfect metaphor for the consortium's soul, vast, intricate, and utterly devoid of nature. When Reese arrived, Elian was already there, standing before the thick plasteel window, his back to the door. He wore his highest collar, but it felt like a child's paper shield. He did not turn. He felt the shift in the room's atmosphere, the familiar drop in temperature, the subtle scent of frost and ozone that now clung to his own skin like a shroud. "You requested my presence," Reese said. It was not a question. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man in absolute control. Elian finally turned to face him. He had expected to feel fear, to tremble, but the white-hot rage from the night before had cooled into a core of hard, unyielding ice. He met the Alpha's cold, grey eyes directly. "Why?" The word was quiet, but it filled the small room. Reese's expression did not change. There was no flicker of surprise, no hint of guilt. He regarded Elian with a detached, analytical patience, as if waiting for a complex machine to complete its diagnostic cycle. "Your question is imprecise," he stated. "Specify your inquiry." "You know what I'm asking." Elian's voice was low, tight with suppressed fury. "You came into my dwelling. You marked me. You bonded me against my will while I was unconscious. I am asking you why." Reese inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not apology. "I did what was necessary." The calm certainty of his words was more shocking than any shouted confession. "Necessary?" Elian repeated, a hysterical laugh threatening to bubble up from his chest. "Necessary for what? For you?" "For you," Reese corrected him, his tone unwavering. "And for the stability of the system. You were an anomaly, Elian, an unpresented Omega of your age, with your sensitive disposition, is a catalyst for chaos. Your hormonal cycle was beginning to destabilize despite the suppressants. It would have led to an uncontrolled heat, a pheromonal event that would have endangered yourself and disrupted the order of this sector. I observed the data. I made a logical assessment." Elian stared at him, horrified. "The data? You speak of my life, my body, as if it's a logistical problem." "It is," Reese said, with no hint of irony. "Biology is the ultimate logistical problem. It is messy, inefficient, and prone to catastrophic failure. The bond, our bond, imposes order. It stabilizes your system, integrates you into a controlled, symbiotic relationship, and ensures your biological imperatives do not threaten the greater good. I did not act out of malice or selfish desire. I acted as a corrective agent." He took a step closer, and Elian fought the primal urge to retreat. "I have seen what happens when Omegas like you are left to their own devices. My own family, our genetic line carries a marker for emotional dysregulation in Omegas. It leads to hysteria, self-harm, a complete breakdown of rational thought. It is a flaw in the code. I saved you from that fate, the same fate that befell your mother." The words struck Elian like a physical blow. His mother. She had died when he was young, the official record citing systemic biological failure. He had no memories of her, only a profound sense of absence. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. "Your mother was institutionalized after a violent psychotic break during an unsanctioned heat," Reese stated, his voice flat, clinical, as if reading a report. "She was a danger to herself and others. The consortium's intervention was too late to save her mind. They placed her in stasis, where she remains. My actions have prevented you from suffering the same genetic destiny. You should be grateful. Gratitude He wanted Elian to be grateful for this violation, this theft of his selfhood. He saw it all now. Rhys was not just a man. He was a zealot. He was a true believer in the consortium's ideology of control, so much so that he had taken it upon himself to be its instrument. He saw his actions not as a crime, but as a duty, a holy crusade against the chaos of emotion and biology. "You are a monster," Elian said, the words falling from his lips, cold and heavy. For the first time, a flicker of something, not anger, but a kind of severe disappointment, crossed Rhys's face. "You are emotional, irrational. The bond has not yet fully stabilized your cognitive functions. The supplement will accelerate the process. Do not neglect to take it." He turned to leave, his duty done, the explanation delivered. "I will not be your experiment," Elian called after him, his voice shaking but clear. "I will not be erased." Rhys paused at the door, his back still to Elian. "You mistake erasure for refinement. The baser parts of you will be quieted, yes, but what remains will be stronger, more stable, perfected." He did not look back as he left, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss, leaving Elian alone with the horrifying panorama of the orderly city and the chaotic ruin of his life. The confrontation had changed nothing, and yet it had changed everything. The enemy now had a face, a voice, and a chillingly rational philosophy. And Elian knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was not just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for his very soul. The sterile white walls of Elian's dwelling, once a symbol of quiet suffocation, now felt like the closing jaws of a trap. Rhys's confession had stripped away any lingering hope of a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, ideological act of subjugation, and the system Rhys served was now an active participant in his imprisonment. The consortium's presence in his life, once passive and bureaucratic, became overt and watchful. Subtle changes began to occur. The nutrient rations delivered to his door were now sealed with a biometric lock keyed to his specific protein signature, ensuring only he could consume them. He knew, with sickening certainty, that the specialized supplement was now being mixed directly into his food supply. He stopped eating altogether, the gnawing hunger a preferable alternative to ingesting the chemical tools of his own erasure. His physical deterioration was rapid. Weakness settled into his limbs, a constant dizziness fogged his thoughts, and the pangs of hunger were a dull, constant ache. The bond, however, seemed to feed on his weakness. The psychic intrusions from Rhys grew stronger, more persistent. It was as if his own weakened mind had less strength to maintain its defenses. He felt Rhys's cool satisfaction at reports of sector productivity, his faint annoyance at a subordinate's error, the dispassionate calm with which he signed orders that would dictate the fates of thousands. He was living a half-life, a ghost in his own body, haunted by the sterile consciousness of his captor. More unsettling were the new environmental sensors that appeared in his dwelling, small, almost invisible discs on the ceiling and walls, their tiny blue lights indicating they were active. They were bio-scanners, calibrated to monitor his hormonal levels, his heart rate, his pheromonal output. They were watching his body betray him. They were collecting data on the illegal bond, studying him like a rare specimen in a sterile jar. Rhys was using the consortium's own security apparatus to monitor his experiment, and he used the threat of that same system as his primary weapon of control. The Central Registry has detected a non-sanctioned pheromonal bond in this sector. Reese told him during another unwanted visit. He did not need to force his way in. His prefect status gave him universal access. He stood in the center of Elian's room, an immovable pillar of authority. An investigation is underway. They are sweeping the sector, running biometric checks on all designations of interest, especially unpresented Omegas. He let the words hang in the air. When they find you, and they will not be as understanding as I am. They will see you as a contaminated asset. You will be taken to a biosecurity facility. They will place you in stasis and deconstruct the bond at a cellular level to study it. The process is unpleasant and permanent. You will spend whatever is left of your life as a living sample in a laboratory. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over Elian, who was huddled on his cot, too weak to stand. Or, Reese continued, his voice a low, reasonable murmur. You can accept my protection. I can alter the records, classify our bond as a sanctioned experimental pairing for the study of genetic stabilization. I can shield you from the investigation. All you must do is stop resisting. Accept the bond. Accept my guidance. Allow the process to complete. The irony was a bitter acid in Elian's throat. The system that was meant to protect him was now the monster Reese was offering to save him from. It was a perfect trap. Submission was a slow death of the self. Defiance was a swift, clinical annihilation. He looked up at the Alpha, at the calm, rational face of his tormentor, and saw the faint, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. A flicker of strain, Elian's resistance, his refusal to eat, his constant mental rebellion. It was affecting Reese too. The bond was a two-way street, and his pain, his fear, his defiant rage was a constant, low-level static in the back of the Alpha's pristine mind. It was an irritant, a flaw in his perfect solution. The knowledge was a spark of warmth in the cold emptiness of his despair. Kale was his last, tenuous link to his old life, but that link was corroding under the strain of Elian's secrecy. Kale visited daily, his face etched with a growing, helpless panic. He brought nutrient supplements from the black market, pleading with Elian to eat. "Talk to me, Elian," he begged, his voice cracking. "Whatever this is, we can face it. Is it Reese? Is he pressuring you? I can talk to him, I can—" "No," Elian cut him off, his voice a dry rasp. "You can't. Stay away from him, Kale. Just stay away." He couldn't tell him the truth. To involve Kale would be to condemn him. Reese would see it as another variable to be controlled, and Kale, a simple beta archivist, would be crushed by the machinery of the prefect's influence. Protecting Kale meant pushing him away, and the isolation was a new kind of agony. He was cornered. His body was failing, his mind was under siege, and his only friend was being forced away. The walls were closing in, and time was running out. He lay on his cot that night, the blue lights of the sensors like cold, unblinking eyes, and felt the tendrils of Reese's consciousness probing at his defenses. He felt the Alpha's frustration, his cold determination. Reese was preparing to escalate things, to force the issue. A medical team, a forced sedation. It was the next logical step in his plan. Elian knew he had to make a choice. He could surrender to the slow, gentle death of the soul that Reese offered, or he could make a final, desperate bid for the violent, uncertain chance of freedom. He thought of the encrypted file. He thought of the word, sanctuary. It was a myth, a ghost story, but it was the only hope he had left. He would run. The decision to escape was not a moment of soaring hope, but one of cold, hard necessity. It was the choice of an animal gnawing off its own leg to escape a trap. The plan was a patchwork of desperate hopes and fragmented information gleaned from the unmaking and other whispers in the undercurrent. Sanctuary was not a place on any official map. It was a ghost, a rumor of a rogue settlement in the outlands, the vast, untamed territories beyond the consortium's climate-controlled cities. It was said to be a place where designations didn't matter, where biology was not a cage, and where the air was not recycled. To get there, he had to first get out of the city, a feat that was next to impossible. Every exit was a checkpoint, every transport tube scanned for biometric and pheromonal signatures. His illegal bond was a blaring alarm he carried under his skin. His only chance was the underbelly of the city, the old, decommissioned service tunnels, a labyrinthine network used for waste disposal and utility maintenance. The network was officially sealed, but the files he'd found spoke of hidden access points, of routes used by smugglers and dissidents. He had one contact, a name from a forum, a shadow who called himself Ferryman. The instructions for contact were cryptic, requiring him to be at a specific waste reclamation hub at a specific time, with a specific item for trade. A blank, untraceable data chip, a valuable commodity in the information-controlled world. He spent his last reserves of energy preparing. He forced himself to drink water, knowing dehydration would be his first enemy. He packed a small bag with the last of the black market nutrient bars Kyle had given him, a water filter, and the modified datapad, its battery charged to full. He looked around the small white dwelling that had been his entire world. It was a prison, but it was a familiar one. Leaving it meant stepping into an unknown that was likely to kill him. He had one last thing to do. He had to say goodbye to Kale without saying goodbye at all. When his friend arrived for his daily, tortured visit, Elian forced himself to sit up, to meet his eyes. "Kyle," he began, his voice weak but clear, "I need you to stop coming here." Kyle recoiled, as if struck. "What?" "Elian, no. I'm not abandoning you." "You're not," Elian insisted, his heart aching with the lie. "But your presence, the stress of your worry, it's making it worse. I need to be alone to stabilize. Please, if you care about me, give me some space. I'll message you when I'm better." He saw the hurt in Kale's eyes, the deep, wounded confusion. He was severing the last tie that held him to this world, and it was the cruelest thing he had ever done. Kyle argued, pleaded, but Elian remained firm, a cold mask hiding his inner turmoil. Finally, defeated, Kyle nodded, his shoulders slumped. "All right, Elian, if that's what you need. But I'll be waiting. Just be safe." He left, and the silence that descended was absolute. Elian was truly alone now. As the designated time approached, he dressed in dark, functional clothing, pulling a hood over his head. He looked at his reflection one last time in the polished chrome of the sanitation unit. A pale, gaunt stranger stared back, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He was no longer the quiet, passive Omega who sculpted faces from clay. He was something else now, something being forged in fear and defiance. The bond chose that moment to flare. A wave of cold, sharp suspicion washed over him, an echo of Reese's thoughts. The Alpha was in his office, reviewing security logs. He had noted Elian's isolation, his refusal to see Kyle. He had noted the slight energy fluctuations from the dwelling's power grid as the datapad charged. They were tiny anomalies. But to a mind like Reese's, anomalies were warnings. He was coming. Elian didn't need the bond to know it. He could feel it as a cold certainty in his gut. He had to leave now. He slipped the data chip into his pocket and moved to the wall panel that concealed the dwelling's waste disposal chute. It was a tight, disgusting fit, but the schematics he'd studied showed it led down to the central reclamation hub 2 levels below. He pried the panel open. The stench of ozone and recycled waste wafted out. He took one last look at the sterile white room, a cage he was finally leaving. Then he lowered himself into the darkness, the metal scraping against his clothes. He was seconds away from closing the panel when he felt it, a powerful, targeted pulse through the bond. It wasn't just an emotional echo. It was a direct, conscious intrusion. Reese knew. He was in the transit system, moving at high speed, his mind a laser of cold, focused rage. "You will not leave," the thought came, not in words, but as a pure, commanding concept. "You are mine." Elian gritted his teeth, pushing back with all his might, focusing on the image of the weeping Omega, on the cold words Reese had spoken about his mother. He used his pain as a shield. He slid the panel shut, plunging himself into a claustrophobic darkness, the roar of the reclamation system below, and the silent scream of the Alpha in his head, his only companions. The escape had begun. The descent through the waste chute was a jarring, terrifying ordeal. The narrow tube was slick with grime, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint, emergency lighting of the levels he passed. He slid and scrambled, his body buffeted against the cold metal, the roar of the machinery below growing louder, more menacing. The entire time, the psychic assault from Reese was relentless. It was no longer a series of passive intrusions, but a targeted, weaponized attack. Reese was hammering at his mental walls, trying to overwhelm him, to paralyze him with fear and confusion. Images flashed through Elian's mind, unbidden and violent. The cold, sterile interior of a stasis pod, the sharp, painful glint of a surgical laser, his own body, pale and still on a metal table. They were threats, psychic projections designed to break his will. He fought back, his own mind a maelstrom of desperate defiance. He clung to the single, burning purpose of his flight, using it as an anchor. Sanctuary, locus, the unmaking. The words were a mantra against the Alpha's mental barrage. He finally tumbled out of the chute into the reclamation hub. The cavernous space was a stark contrast to the clean, orderly world above. It was a place of raw function, filled with the deafening clang of machinery, the hiss of hydraulics, and the foul stench of the city's refuse. Dim yellow light cast long, dancing shadows, turning the massive piles of scrap and the complex network of pipes into a hellish, industrial landscape. He was disoriented, his head spinning from the psychic static and the sensory overload. He checked the time on his datapad. He was late. He scrambled through the metallic labyrinth, following the directions from the encrypted map. He found the designated meeting point, a secluded alcove behind a dormant plasma furnace. It was empty. A cold knot of despair tightened in his chest. Had he missed his chance? Had the ferryman given up and left? Looking for someone? A low voice rasped from the shadows. Elian spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. A figure detached itself from the darkness. They were tall and gaunt, their face obscured by a rebreather mask and dark goggles. They were wrapped in layers of patched utilitarian cloth, their designation impossible to discern beneath the scent-blocking fabric and the overwhelming stench of the hub. "Ferryman," Elian whispered. The figure gave a slight nod. "You're late, and you're loud." Elian didn't understand. He hadn't said a word. "Not with your mouth," the ferryman clarified, tapping the side of their head. "In here. You're broadcasting like a distress beacon. He's hunting you." The ferryman was a sensitive, someone with a natural or augmented psychic ability. They could feel the psychic battle raging between Ilian and Rhys. "The chip," the ferryman said, their voice impatient. Elian fumbled in his pocket and produced the data chip. The figure took it, inspecting it briefly before pocketing it. "All right, the deal is a deal. I get you to the tunnel entrance. From there you're on your own. The Outlands don't care if you're an Alpha, Beta, or Omega. They'll eat you just the same." They moved with a swift, silent grace through the industrial chaos. Elian struggled to keep up, his weakened body protesting every step. The pressure in his head was intensifying. Rhys was getting closer. He could feel the Alpha's physical proximity, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the psychic link. He was being hunted, not just mentally, but physically. They arrived at a massive, circular sewer grate, sealed with a rusted iron wheel. The ferryman produced a long metal lever and began to pry at the seal. "Hurry," Ilian urged, his voice strained. He risked a glance back the way they came and saw them. Two figures in the grey uniforms of the Consortium's enforcers, moving with tactical precision through the shadows, their helmet-mounted lights cutting sharp cones through the gloom. And between them, walking with a calm, predatory stride, was Rhys. He wasn't wearing a helmet. His face was a mask of cold fury, his grey eyes sweeping the area, searching. The bond flared, a sharp, painful spike as Rhys's eyes locked onto his position. It was a physical jolt, like a psychic harpoon tearing into him. "There you are." The thought was a death sentence. "They found us," Elian cried. The grate finally gave way with a groan of tortured metal. "Go!" The ferryman yelled, pushing him toward the dark opening. "Now!" Elian scrambled into the tunnel, the stench of raw sewage and decay washing over him. He heard a shout from behind, the sharp crack of a pulse rifle firing, the sound of the energy bolt impacting metal near the ferryman. He didn't look back. He ran, plunging deeper into the suffocating darkness of the city's forgotten veins. The tunnel was a nightmare. The floor was slick with effluent, the air thick and unbreathable. He stumbled through the darkness, his only guide the faint beam of his datapad's light. But he was not alone. Rhys was with him, a constant, terrifying presence in his mind. The Alpha wasn't just broadcasting threats anymore. He was using the bond as a weapon of disorientation. The floor would seem to tilt beneath Elian's feet. The walls would appear to close in. Phantom sounds echoed in the darkness. Rhys was trying to make him fall, to injure himself, to stop. Elian focused on the one advantage he had. The bond was a two-way street. He could feel Rhys, and that meant he could feel what Rhys felt. He opened himself up to the connection, not to receive, but to read. He felt the Alpha's frustration at the Enforcer's slow pace, his cold anger, his unwavering, obsessive focus on his target. Alien. He could feel the direction of the pursuit, the distance between them. He was using the violation as a survival tool. He reached a junction in the tunnels, a crossroads of darkness. The map on his datapad showed 3 possible routes. Which one? He focused, pushing past the psychic noise, and listened to Rhys's mind. He felt a flicker of certainty from the Alpha, a command issued to the enforcers. He will take the most direct route, Sector Gamma 7. Cut him off. Elian immediately veered left, into the smaller, more treacherous tunnel, the opposite of the one Rhys expected. He was learning. He was adapting. The chase continued for what felt like hours. His body screamed in protest. His lungs burned. But he kept moving, fueled by adrenaline and terror. Finally, he saw it. A faint light ahead. A ladder leading up to another grate. According to the map, this was it. An emergency exit that opened into the outlands, just beyond the city's perimeter fence. He climbed, his muscles shaking with exhaustion. He pushed at the grate. It was heavy, but it moved. He squeezed through the opening and collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for air that was shockingly cold and fresh. It smelled of damp earth, of decaying plants, of rain. It was the chaotic, uncontrolled scent of the real world. He was out. He had made it. He staggered to his feet and looked back. The gleaming, sterile towers of the consortium city rose behind him, a monument to the ordered world he had just escaped. And in his mind, he felt Rhys. The Alpha was standing at the edge of the city, at the perimeter fence, staring out into the darkness where Elian now stood. He could not follow. His authority ended where the city's order did, but the bond remained. Elian felt the Alpha's silent, chilling promise resonate across the distance, a cold thread connecting them still. This is not over. Freedom was not a release. It was a different kind of cage. The outlands were a vast, desolate expanse of grey earth and skeletal, leafless trees under a perpetually overcast sky. The air, once a shocking relief, was now a constant, damp chill that seeped into his bones. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the ever-present hum of the city, and it was a silence that felt heavy, watchful. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone, and yet he was not. The bond remained, a faint but persistent psychic tether connecting him to the man he had escaped. Rhys's presence was no longer a deafening roar, but a low, incessant hum at the edge of his consciousness. The direct, violent intrusions had ceased with distance, but the connection was still there. Sometimes a phantom sensation would break through, the taste of a nutrient bar, the feeling of a cool, smooth console beneath fingertips, the cold certainty of a command given. It was a constant, maddening reminder that a part of him was still chained to a cage miles away. His first days were a blur of misery and survival. He followed the fragmented directions from the ferryman's data, heading toward a distant, jagged line of mountains where sanctuary was rumored to be hidden. He rationed the nutrient bars, drank filtered, metallic-tasting water from stagnant pools, and slept in hollows or under rocky overhangs, his sleep shallow and plagued by nightmares. His body, accustomed to a lifetime of controlled environments and synthesized nutrition, rebelled against the harsh reality of the wilderness. He was weak, constantly cold, and his hunger was a living thing inside him. During the long, monotonous hours of walking, he practiced what he had learned from the unmaking. He worked on his mental wall, no longer a desperate, crumbling barrier, but a structure he was slowly, deliberately reinforcing. He learned to identify the subtle tendrils of Rhys's influence, to isolate them, and to sever them before they could take root in his thoughts. He began to map the seam between their minds, to understand its topography. It was exhausting, painstaking work, a form of meditation born of sheer necessity. And in his moments of greatest despair, he began to fight back in a new way. He didn't project rage or fear anymore. He projected the raw, unfiltered sensory experience of the Outlands. He sent Reese the biting cold of the wind, the sharp pain in his blistered feet, the gnawing emptiness of his stomach, the overwhelming taste of decay and wild, untamed earth. He wanted the Alpha, in his sterile, controlled office, to feel the chaos he had been so desperate to escape. He wanted him to understand that this brutal, painful freedom was still infinitely preferable to the comfortable, ordered death he offered. He didn't know if it was working, but the act of doing it, of turning the bond from a tool of his oppression into a weapon of his own, gave him a sliver of strength to continue. After a week that felt like a lifetime, he saw it. A thin plume of smoke rising against the grey sky, nestled in a high, hidden valley in the foothills of the mountains. Hope, fierce and painful, surged through him. He pushed his exhausted body onward, scrambling up a steep, rocky path. The settlement, when he finally reached it, was not the idyllic paradise he might have dreamed of. It was a chaotic, ramshackle collection of structures built from scavenged city materials and natural resources, clinging to the mountainside like a stubborn lichen. The air was thick with the smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the unmasked scents of dozens of people, Alpha, Beta, and Omega, living in close, unregulated proximity. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault after a lifetime of sterility, but it was the smell of life. They called it sanctuary. The people here were refugees, dissidents, and runaways, all of whom had fled the consortium for their own reasons. They were wary of him at first, a half-starved stranger with the haunted look of the newly escaped. But they saw the desperation in his eyes, and they took him in. He was given a bowl of hot, savory stew that made him weep with its richness, and a place to sleep by a communal fire. He told his story to an elder, a calm, weathered Omega named Anya, her scent a comforting mix of dry herbs and earth. He showed her the mark on his neck, faded now, but still a clear, puckered scar. She examined it with a sad, knowing look in her eyes. "A forced bond," she murmured, her voice filled with a deep, ancient anger. "The ultimate act of consortium arrogance, to rewrite a soul because its song is not to their liking." She confirmed that the legends were true. Locus, the neuroinhibitor, existed. It grew only in one place, a deep geothermal cave system high in the mountains, a place they considered sacred. But she warned him that the process of severance, what they called the unmaking, was an ordeal. "The bond is a part of your neurology now," she explained, her gaze serious. "To rip it out is to rip out a piece of yourself. The locus will dissolve the chemical anchor, but you must be the one to sever the psychic thread. It will be the hardest thing you have ever done. It will require you to face the one you are bound to, in the space between your minds, and win." Elia knew he had no other choice. To live with Reese's ghost in his head forever was not living at all. He spent the next few weeks recovering his strength, learning the rhythms of life in sanctuary. It was a hard life, full of manual labor and constant challenges, but it was a life of profound freedom. He worked in the gardens, his hands in real soil, coaxing life from the ground. For the first time, he felt the sun, unfiltered, on his skin. He saw the stars, not as pinpricks in a simulated sky, but as a brilliant, chaotic tapestry in the clear, cold night. He began to sculpt again, not with processed clay, but with wood he gathered from the forest, his hands slowly remembering their purpose. He was rediscovering himself, piece by piece. But the hum of the bond was always there, a dissonant note in the growing harmony of his new life. He knew he could not be truly whole until it was gone. When he felt he was ready, he went to Anya. "It's time," he said. She nodded and led him up the mountain to the mouth of the sacred cave to face the final battle for his own mind.